Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Digital and Paper, Minimize Risk and Embrace Opportunity Through Digital Transformation. My name is Teresa Resick, and I'm the Director of Market Intelligence here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's webinar. And joining me today are thought leaders Dan AIIM and John Montaigne. Very pleased to have them here with us. And I would just like to thank Access as the underwriter of today's webinar. Thank them very much for their support and for underwriting our event today. And certainly thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us. As we get started, just want to offer a few tips for participating in today's webinar. By joining live, you can resize the different windows that are in front of you. Also in the list of icons across the bottom, one of those is group chat, and I do encourage you to open that. And with that, you will be able to text message with each other and also with a few of us here at AIIM. There's also resources for you to download, a lot of really cool links in there. So check those out, and do ask questions of the speakers with the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. And we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes later in the webcast for Q&A time. Do take the survey, and there is the icon for the survey is in that list across the bottom. I do value your feedback tremendously. I do read everything that you all post in here, so would appreciate it if you would take the time to answer those few questions for us after the webinar is over with. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. And now I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have joining us today. Dan AIIM is Vice President at Envision, and Dan is a leading consultant for information governance programs, including records and email management, sensitive information, and country-specific regulations. He is a former U.S. technical expert to ISO, the International Standards Organization, and he is a frequent industry author and speaker. Dan is a longtime member of AIIM and is in the AIIM Company of Fellows. And we also have with us today John Montaigne, and he is an attorney and a CEO of the information management consulting firm Montaigne & Associates, and that is an Access company. In this capacity, John advises corporations, law firms, and nonprofit organizations on records and information management. He is a published author and is widely recognized as one of the foremost records management experts in the country. So right now, I am going to turn things over to Dan AIIM to begin our talk today. Dan?
Thanks, Teresa. Well, it's nice to see so many familiar faces, at least virtually on here today. And this will make this session a little fun, because a lot of you that are on here already know that the volumes that we're talking about managing are just unbelievable. I mean, we've moved from early stages of worrying about megabytes to now zettabytes in terms of what we're looking at, and the numbers just keep going up. And the problem is that so many of the things that we've traditionally done came from the classic paper world, where we were figuring out how to put color coding on files to be able to manage them and move things forward. And so many of the things that we have even on the records management side are all basically designed to make those processes faster without fundamentally changing some of them. Well, what that means, though, is that those processes aren't really set up to handle the modern environment. So we've not evolved a lot of the things that we traditionally do in the intelligent information space to reflect the changing in the underlying technology, and just in terms of the processes. So here's a classic example. So we get in a source document that it has some information, we get it in, it goes into a database, and then it ends up in a data lake or a data warehouse. So now the problem is, where do I need to manage this? What's the official source? What is going to be the place that we make our decisions from? A lot of cases it'll be the database. Well, then if I get rid of something in the database, do I have a default back to the source file, the original document that I had, or now am I using the data lake or the data warehouse where maybe everyone doesn't have access? So we're continuing to manipulate the data. If there's one thing that we're really good about in North America, it's that, by golly, if we can capture information, we're going to repurpose it and reuse it in lots of different ways. And so we end up with a real huge proliferation of this information. And now, though, we've got these new things like the California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR that are creating new demands, new things that we have to comply with that the systems themselves were never designed to be able to handle. So now I've got to be able to, have the right to be forgotten and get rid of the information that I have. Where am I going to go find that? So how am I going to find it to begin with? How am I going to manage it? What am I going to do for things that are in paper or electronic and manage all of that stuff? We don't have things that were set up to be able to find these things quickly and to be able to ensure that we've gotten rid of the information or we've provided all of it back. That just wasn't something that was part of the design as we put these systems together. So with all of that, we also end up with redundant, obsolete, and trivial or rot information being at an all-time high. So, some of the customers I work with, what we're finding is that 70 to 80% of the information is actually rot. And that's pretty consistent, where it works out to be that only about 25, 26% of the information is an active record. And then you might have a small amount of additional information that you keep for reference files or working files. But the bottom line is that we're spending a fortune to be able to manage this information, and it becomes a liability in some of these cases. So that gives us certain opportunities when it comes to return on investment. So there are 6 key areas, and we're not going to review all of these today, but there definitely is productivity. You guys can certainly see that. Anytime you have fewer things you have to search through, the higher your productivity is going to be. E-discovery costs are extremely high. On average, we spend about $2,000 per gigabyte looking for information. Certain court cases, it's been as much as $80,000 per gigabyte to be able to sort through the information. The storage costs alone continue to go up because of the rot and just the increases in information. And I think one of the things that's a surprise is that even though storage costs on a per gigabyte basis have declined even faster than microprocessors have increased in processing power, the storage cost that organizations spend still goes up on average more than 10% per year. So even though we're getting storage cheaper and cheaper, we manage just to consume all of that and more very, very quickly. So you've got fines and sanctions. You've got the issues where an auditor needs information, and maybe that's not necessarily a fine or a sanction, but it still has cost. And then you do have things with the regulators where you may have information. And now we've got data breach issues, and the data breach issues have their own costs, but now you also have things that really can affect the viability of a company and what the long-term implications are. Sony being a good example. Marriott is spending a fortune for handling their data breach. And the thing is, if I had less data, the implications would be less than what these organizations have seen. The other thing that's important to remember is that this is a continuously changing industry. The problem is that we go with the legal thresholds of reasonable and customary. Basically, if it's good enough for our normal course of business, it's good enough for the courts. Well, the problem is that things change. Most of you are familiar with the Pony Express. We've all heard about it. It's been in old TV shows and movies and stuff for many years. It transformed the information flow, that we could now get information in days all the way across the country. That was great if you were trading in commodities like tobacco or corn, because it shortened the time frame. But the interesting thing is, for all of the impact that the Pony Express had, it only lasted for 18 months. And that's because the telegraph came along and wiped it out almost overnight. So what happened is now we could much more quickly transfer information and be able to get the information to people that needed to. So if you were in business, you needed to use the telegraph just to be able to be competitive and to be able to do what was in your industry. That's the same that we have today. What we were doing 10 years ago for managing our content is not going to be something that's going to be acceptable on a mainstream basis, much less to the courts as we move forward. When we put together the teams, we also have to understand that it's no longer just the records manager that was stuck in the bottom of the basement. The teams today for handling information are really multidisciplinarians. We've got to have folks from legal, operations, IT, compliance, security, and maybe others that understand all of the impact. So it really is a group effort. Today, information management has gone well beyond what any one person can do. And so we need to be thinking about this in terms of a discipline and how we move things forward, because it's going to take a lot of different skills. The other thing is that it's really important to understand that we really have to look at outsourcing. There is no way that most organizations can be competitive just in terms of cost with an outsourcing vendor. And, there are all kinds of hidden costs that you have typically internally, but they can invest in better technology, and they'll have tighter processes than you can handle internally. So this part really is a big deal, that you have to understand what processes you want to keep in-house, and then where you want to leverage outsourcing to get an advantage. And keep in mind, again, it's back to that same thing, that the business is going to change some over time, so you need to be as close to what the outsourcing providers can provide if you want to be certain that you're going to be in the mainstream for your industry, or if you need to be able to support litigation or court issues where you've got to show that you have a reasonable process. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that you're going to have some automated tools replace humans. Because the information is just so high in volume, we can't do everything that we used to do with humans. So we're going to have automated tools that take a look at some of the information. We're going to have automated tools that help us get rid of information. We're going to have automated tools that do classification and figure out, what's secure, what's, valuable intellectual property, because we can't rely on people to do it. It's just not possible today. And so the key is making sure that you have an understanding of where tools can fit, but also understanding where the tools don't fit. So you're going to have to figure out exactly what's going to be appropriate for your environment. And again, that's an area where the outsourcers can probably help, because you can use some automated tools and then use the tools that they have to complement your technology stack. And then, of course, they'll have the people and processes for the other things. So the last thing I want to leave you with is just quickly going through, when you're planning your projects, there's 6 key things to focus on. So in any program for a life cycle, you need to be able to locate the information. And this is a real problem, particularly for things like privacy, where I don't even know where the information is. Is it in this database? Is it in this file cabinet? Is it in this ECM system? Is it in SharePoint? Is it on a cloud somewhere? It's real important that you get a good understanding about where that information is. And then figure out who are the owners, who has access to it. You don't want to have wide access to information. You need to know who the owners are to be able to figure out how you get rid of it and what you do with it. So it's important that you build that map of who owns it and continuously updating that. Also, not all information is equally valuable. And, I know many of the people that are on this session today have been around for a long time, and, we've tried really hard to have these monolithic processes to treat all information the same. And what we found is that really just isn't viable. There's just so much information out there. We can't treat, every single little email the same as a, notarized document that relates to transaction closing. So we have to prioritize and protect the most valuable. So understanding how to segment and protect it from data breaches and from, internal access, but also just how we're going to manage it in terms of risk for what is it we're going to have that may cause, downstream issues. We need to figure out how to respond to those who need the info, whether that means, in privacy cases, whether, such as consumers or regulators or somebody else, but understanding what those scenarios are in those use cases is very important as you move forward. And, of course, everyone here knows that it's important that we only retain what is needed. So, records management has changed from the idea of how do we keep everything to now how do I defensively dispose of it as soon as I can appropriately do so. Not trying to hide information, but trying to make sure that we follow our processes so that we don't have extra information that ends up driving up our cost and our liability. And finally, the actual defensible disposition, the deleting of information. And you guys all know how hard it is to get the business units to say, okay, yes, let's push that delete button. But that's a real important part of making all of these things come true. So understanding how you can work with the business units to figure out what do we need to get rid of, how everybody is comfortable, what are we going to do with it, and what's going to be the rules. those are things that you need to plan for any kind of program where you're going to be managing information governance. So we've talked a little bit about the strategic side. Now I want to turn it over to John, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the tactical way about making sure that you can manage this information. John?
Thanks, Dan. Thank you all for being here. It's good to be here with you today. I'll warn you in advance, I've got a cold, so I will try and hit the mute button if I'm going to cough, but if I cough, that's what's going on. So, Dan has made some very interesting points here, and it leads into my discussion quite directly because these days, many, if not most, records start digital. And we think that's a great thing, and it is a great thing. I mean, as Dan has pointed out, we've got information volumes that can only be digital in many cases, and we certainly got processes that are not capable or not possible in some places with paper records. But then the problems begin, because as we all know, those of you who have spent any length of time in this business know full well that in every office there's a printer, and many of those digital records turn into paper records. And so all of a sudden you've got two or more, and oftentimes many more than two, sets of the same record, and so it starts to be a problem. But even if they're not turned into paper, Dan's pie chart is illustrative of the problem that we have. Systems don't have any meaningful purge capacities, and so the pie gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's more rot in there because we have no meaningful way to get things out of there. Data is frequently not migrated due to expense, right? As we all know, systems go out of date pretty quickly, every 3, 4, 5 years in many cases, and there's a big question as to how much of that data gets migrated. If it doesn't get migrated, it can well be lost, right? And so you have big decisions there, and they're all suboptimal decisions. Another version of that is the data warehouse problem, or the data lake problem. These places often become black holes because there's no meaningful purge capacity, and because there's no real process for purging. People tend to think of these things as the next panacea, and so they just stuff information in there and stuff data in there, and sooner or later it hits a bursting point, right? And of course, in all of these cases, we're dealing with a real problem, which is what those Zeta bytes are all about, which is that the ease of duplication contributes not only to exponential growth rates, but to loss of control. And there is I think, a key issue. When you think about data breaches, and when you think about privacy violations, one of the key problems that you have, and these are big risks these days. We're in a landscape where privacy and data security are really critical issues for any organization, whether you're a business or a nonprofit government. But all of those issues begin with a loss of control, and all of those extra copies that are going out there to all these various places are the first step in that loss of control, and ultimately towards violations of various kinds. So all of these are problems. And what happens, okay? Dan mentioned these compounded growth rates, and these are the real industry figures. And if you look in your own organization, you'll discover that these figures are legit, right? In unstructured data sets, you frequently see 40 to 60, matter of fact, most people see 40 to 60% growth rates compounded. So this is a geometric curve, right? So these data sets get bigger and bigger and bigger, and as Dan mentioned, storage costs generally go down 10% a year. Well, this 40 to 60% rate is utterly swamping that 10% storage density increase, right? So that's why these storage budgets keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because people keep saying, well, storage is getting cheaper. Well, it's not getting 40 to 60% a year cheaper for sure, okay? And not only that, but thinking about the lack of control, we have huge, massive dark data sets in many organizations, perhaps most organizations. What's a dark data set? It's a data set that you don't even know what's in it. Okay? And that's a whole bunch of the rock that was in Dan's pie chart that should be a concern for every organization, because there are regulatory issues, there are discovery issues, there are privacy issues, there are data security issues attendant upon those dark data sets. And it's such a big problem that there's a whole class of software that's been developed to help solve the dark data problem, because it's a pervasive big dollar problem. but it's out there, and you commonly see it. If you're in my business or Dan's business, you go out here and you see this sort of thing on a routine basis, where all of this is happening. And as a result of all of this, there's all sorts of vulnerability. Not only is there vulnerability, as I point out here, to hacking and other data loss, but if you get into a discovery situation, you have to start going through these data sets. As Dan pointed out, it's extensive. And there are potential privacy violations. There can be regulatory violations if you're in some sort of regulated industry. So it's all a huge problem. And it's a pervasive problem these days because people typically execute digitization very poorly. So I want to step back and think for a second about the 20th century and pose this question. Should we digitize it in the first place, right? I mean, it's the 21st century, and we think of records as being digital, and we tend to think of digitizing as a superior solution. The question is it really a superior solution? And I say that it depends. Okay? First of all, it depends upon your ability to control the digital records after creation. And those dark data sets would tend to indicate that people are not very good at that. Okay? And there are a number of common errors that we used to see when I was young and in this business at the first part of my career in the late 80s, early 90s, that we still see today. People digitize records without adequately thinking through how to control them after they create them. And that's a terrible, terrible problem. And it comes down even to basic flaws of procedure. So, for example, I was just talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago at a conference, and lo and behold, a problem that was one of the first problems I ever saw in my professional career arose again, which is that they had people in their organization imaging paper records, and they had no index or no metadata whatsoever. Just a great big stack of hundreds of thousands of images with those mysterious serial numbers on them, and folks did not understand what the problem there was. Well, they're unidentifiable, they're uncontrollable. And we still see that a lot, okay? So there's that threshold issue. There's the cost of digitization. And you know, digitization is expensive. If you're going to image paper records, or you're going to set up a big database or data warehouse or data lake of some kind, this is not a cheap proposition. So you have to look at the cost of the digitization versus the value of the digitization. And the cost-value equation does not always work out in favor of digitization. Okay? Finally, the need for remote and simultaneous access is a big reason for digitization. Sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes one guy in an office someplace is the only guy that's ever going to look at something, and it's perfectly okay for him to pull down a binder from a shelf. And finally, the lifespan of the record, okay? It's worth thinking about that because, as we all know, digital records tend to die pretty quickly. Systems die pretty quickly. Operating systems die pretty quickly. Languages, computer languages, that is, die pretty quickly. And it's pretty tough for us to read anything that's as much as 15 years old, right? And in many cases, we can't. Well, there are cases where you need a record for a much longer period of time than that. So let's think about that, okay? So first of all, you imagine yourself as being the manager of a nuclear waste dump, okay? That nuclear waste dump has a life of hundreds of thousands of years. And the records of what you put in that nuclear waste dump likewise have a lifespan of hundreds of thousands of years. In such a case, digitization may not be a very good solution for you, okay? And that's an extreme example, but there are others. You're running a nuclear power plant, you're going to have the same version, or a hazardous waste dump of some kind, or other situations where you've got circular concerns, which is to say Superfund concerns, and you're going to have to keep some records around for 100 years of it, right? All of these places, all of these situations involve records with very, very long lifespans and not very high accession rates. We're only going to be looking at them once in a while. And in such cases, acid-free paper is a pretty good and pretty cheap solution, honestly, okay? Next, we have to think about the cost of digitization, right? If you're going to take a lot of paper records and you're going to image them and maybe OCR them and do some other stuff to them, that's a very expensive process. And if there's a lot of them, you have to look at the value you're going to get. And if point number one up here is the case. You may discover that digitization is not a good solution, okay? And finally, back to my earlier points, if the digitization process is not executed correctly, if you haven't thought through your metadata schemes, if you haven't thought through your indexing, if you haven't thought through all of the things that go into this, and you do a bad job of digitizing your records, you'll discover that you have created a mess that is not only is it not valuable, but it's very expensive and risky on top of it. So you need to think about this last one very, very importantly, because if you don't get it right, it's not a solution at all. It's just another problem. When is a digital repository not a solution? Again, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in my career. People tend to think that buying a piece of software is a solution, okay? And so they just throw it on up there, and it's not managed at all, and it's got bad structure, bad data structure or no data structure, bad data, metadata or no metadata, no process for putting things in. People can just do what they want, and that's a mess, right? And we've all seen that. I'm sure that most of us have seen that. If you've never seen it anyplace else, you've seen it in shared drives, because that's what a shared drive is, basically, is an unmanaged repository. And there are much bigger versions than even the worst shared drive. We see that a lot in very expensive ECM solutions that are not well implemented, right? And next, you have to think about that migration issue. The fact of the matter is, in 5 years, maybe 10 at the outside, you're going to have to take the data in your repository, and you're going to have to move it to the next version of that repository, whatever it turns out to be. If you don't have that commitment, and basically you're going to sunset your data, you may have a problem. And I run into this all the time, that people discover that migrating their data is very expensive, and they don't want to do it, but they're stuck with some bad choices because they may be in a regulated industry, or they may have other issues, which means they can't abandon the data. So you end up having two solutions, a go-forward solution and the older one, the legacy solution, that you still have to maintain because the data in there still has value, or it's subject to a regulatory requirement or something along those lines. So what do? The first thing to remember is that no technology is a solution, right? And we tend to think of software as a solution, right? We can call it software solutions, right? That's the buzzword. Every technology is only a tool, and that goes all the way down from paper to microfilm to the most advanced electronic systems. Each one of these is a tool that can do something for us, but it doesn't do anything by itself. Okay, it only does what we tell it to do. And if we think through thoughtfully what we want it to do, we can perhaps make it do those things. If we don't think anything through at all, which is very commonly the case, it will do bad things for us or nothing at all for us, right? So we have to use every tool thoughtfully and well, or we can use it poorly and carelessly. But if you use it poorly, you are, I mean, we're talking about risk and reward here today. If you use a tool poorly, and that's any tool in our business, not only does your opportunity evaporate pretty quickly, but you're substantially increasing your risk. And Dan talked about that earlier with discovery costs and regulatory problems and rot and just the cost of storage, all of those things. All of those things are risks. They all translate into bottom line dollars that come off of your bottom line, and maybe worse, right? So your opportunity evaporates quickly, and the risk and the costs and other downsides increase very, very quickly in those kinds of situations. So what we have to do really is understand the problem. And oftentimes this is the problem. If we do not actually understand the problem that we are trying to solve and select a tool that will best solve that particular problem, then we are doing ourselves a disservice, because we're not selecting a tool that's likely to be effective, right? We're just throwing money at the problem, and you can't throw money at complex problems. So what do you do? First of all, do you really understand the records and data that you're trying to manage here? And oftentimes people don't. Okay? Do you understand what they're supposed to do, what value they have for the business, what regulatory compliance burden may be upon them, all of the other aspects of those records that we're going to have to bake into our solution, whatever it might be, right? And how long will we need them? Because at the end of the day, we have to select a solution that's going to allow us to maintain them for whatever that period of time might be, but as Dan points out, to ultimately delete them when that time is over with. So we need to know this up front, and that's a very important thing. How much and in what ways will we need to access them? Again, it's a very important thing, because if one person only needs these records, it's one thing. If 1,000 people in 1,000 locations need them on a daily basis, it's a completely different thing, and we have to understand that going in. Can a particular technology support our needs? Is the opportunity really there? And I think this is an important one. This is kind of a summary of the previous points. But at the end of the day, if we don't know these first 3 points here, we can't answer this question. Because does this technology support our needs? Well, who knows? If we don't know what our needs are, how can we select a technology that supports those needs? So we have to understand our own needs, right? And finally, if we select a technology, and again, anything from paper to microfilm to an advanced electronic system, every such technology has some upsides and some downsides and some costs, risks, and challenges, and all of these things. Are we prepared to live with all of that? Are we prepared to support our technology in the way that it needs to be supported in order for it to be an effective solution? These would seem to be relatively elementary questions, right? But the truth is that, and I'm sure Dan will agree with me, you go out here and you see people that buy very expensive pieces of technology, and they have never thought through those questions at all. Okay, they buy the technology first, sew it up second, and then discover it failed third. That is a classic scenario in our business. I don't know how many times I've seen it over the past 30 years, but it's routine, and everybody knows it happens. Because everybody has this easy button mentality, right? This is a common human failing, and I've seen it throughout my entire career in this business. People are looking for a solution that doesn't require them to engage in the thoughtful, detailed, extensive analysis that's necessary to make these things fly. So they're looking for that easy button, and the easy button is the next generation of technology, whether it's imaging systems, as was the case when I was first in this business, or the cloud and all of these things that are in the cloud these days, SharePoint and all of these other things. People are looking for the easy button, and the theory is that if we just migrate our data to whatever the easy button system is, whether it's an imaging system or the cloud, that will solve the problem for us. And so what they classically do is buy first, implement later, and then they discover that they've got a very expensive, and oftentimes very, very expensive, failed technology installation. They've maybe spent a couple of years trying to get up and running, and it doesn't do anything for them. And you see this over and over and over again. So what should we do? Okay, I can't emphasize this enough, and those of you who have heard me in other seminars know that I harp on this all the time. Think before you spend. Okay, people tend to spend the money first because you've got that budget and boy, you want to do something with it. You should not spend money at all until you've done significant planning and understanding of your own needs, right? And therefore, the technology spend should come at the very end of the process, not the first part of the process. You don't buy the technology first and then try and pound your records and problems into it. Not at all. But that's what people do. So you have to understand the problem you're trying to solve, okay? And what that means is, going back to my previous points, understand the records involved, understand their characteristics and why you need them and what burdens they may have, and all of that, okay? Knowing that, you can then start to define an effective solution, okay? Because now you understand what it is you're trying to achieve with the solution. Once you do that, you can develop a functional specification for your solution so that you can go out and shop your spec around, right? And once you have that, that's exactly what you do. There are a lot of good solutions out there that solve a lot of different problems. Now you have something against which you can test those solutions. And when you finally have identified the solution that most completely meets your needs, and none of them may be fully meeting your needs, but you can certainly find one that will get close, then you spend money on technology. And if you do that, you'll probably be okay. But unfortunately, people tend not to do that. Oh, we got a question here, by the way. I'll just throw it out really quickly. Maybe Dan and I can answer it because I'm almost done with my little section here. Any advice when your business units have already selected their tools and you're trying to force business rules into the systems like retention periods? That's an interesting question. We see that all the time. So let's hold that off and we'll see if we can answer it. So remember this, okay? I want to leave you with these sort of parting points, okay? Remember, if you find yourself thinking this, give yourself a dope slap. Technology is not the solution, okay? The solution is your planning process and your thinking. The technology is a tool that helps you implement your planning and your thinking, okay? Technology is typically not better or worse, particularly these days. There's a lot of good technology, but it solves a problem. Whoever designed that technology intended it to solve a particular problem or set of problems. Those may not be your problems, and you've got to know whether or not the problems that it solves are the ones that you care about, because if it's not, you're going to have the problem that was just posed in this question, right? And remember that the burden is on you to select the correct tool for your problem set. You can't blame it on anybody else. If you're the decision maker here and you have to pull the trigger, the burden is on you to make it happen correctly. So bear in mind all the things that Dan and I have told you. And with that, that's who I am, and I will turn it over to Teresa.
Well, thank you. Listening here to John Montaigne, and before that, Dan Elam, and this was a really awesome conversation. And frankly, I know I'm going to need to go back and listen to it again myself because there was so much excellent advice that was being offered. And so one of the other things I just want to mention right now before we take all of the questions between the group chat and the Q&A, there's a bunch of different questions that have been coming in. There is a companion tip sheet paper that AIIM has authored in collaboration with Access, and just invite you to download this tip sheet. There is a link in the resources, or if you download a PDF of the slides, just click on this page in that PDF, and that will also link you over to the page where you can download this tip sheet. And that paper is entitled "With Intelligent Information Management Starting Line, 3 Tasks to Target Now." So it is a tip sheet, short and sweet, really good information in there. Invite you to take advantage of that. So getting to all of the questions that we have, and as John mentioned, in the group chat, someone asked out a really good question here, so let's start with that. Where the person is asking any advice on for the business units, if the company has already selected the tool and you're back trying to fill out how to put your business rules into things like retention periods back into a system that you had no hand in helping to select. Dan, let me start with you, and John, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, boy, this is one of those that comes up all the time, and actually, it's actually more common for it to be this way than it is to actually have organizations that have been able to plan out for how they're going to manage it. There basically are 2 key scenarios. One is if you have things that just have a straight date based on either the final date or the creation date. Those are fairly straightforward to work with the business units and apply. You're not going to get much pushback. The problem is going to be when you have rules for retention that are event-based. So where you say, it's this contract we're going to keep for 3 years past the date of the last purchase order, a task order or something attached to it. Those kinds of things require a lot more knowledge, and you're going to have to sit down with the business units. The good news is most of the tools out there will support all the things that you need to do, so it's not really a technology issue, but it is definitely an implementation issue, and it is really tough, but you're going to have to work through with the business units to figure those things out. So, John?
I think it's worth pointing out, too, that the array of solutions available to you is going to be pretty dependent on the software package in question, right? So if, for example, you have implemented SharePoint and you've discovered that SharePoint's retention management is not where you need it to be, in many cases, and SharePoint's one of them, there are some bolt-on packages. They're going to cost you some more money, but things like GimmelSoft and a couple of other software packages will help you manage that pretty effectively. Again, if you're willing to implement them correctly, which is always one of the big problems that Stan observes. In other cases, if the software is not very robust with respect to retention, and sometimes it's not, you end up trying to pound square pegs into round holes, and you get into a world of suboptimal solutions. And that's, if it's a big software spend and you're sort of stuck with it, oftentimes you have to, because you have ideal retention rules that you'd like to implement, and if you can't do that, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what's our fallback strategy for less than ideal retention rules we'd like to implement? And you start working back until you find something that the software can actually do. And you see that a lot, because at the end of the day, what that piece of software is capable of doing is the ultimate limiting factor. If there's no bolt-on available for it, you can only do what it allows you to do. So you have to figure out what that limitation is and then see if you can devise some rules that fit within that limitation.
There is another question that came in, and it's almost a part two to this. What if that tool is already selected? And you touched on this, John, that it's already been in implementation for some time, and you need to either amend an existing business rule or add another one. Once those tools have already been deployed. I just want to make sure that we've adequately answered all of these types of questions here.
Well, I think there's going to be a couple of answers, and it's the answer. I hate to give you a lawyer answer and say it depends, but it really does depend, because depending on the tool, it may have a fairly robust retention capacity that you can leverage by reconfiguration, however painful that may be, and sometimes it is. But if you've got a tool that isn't really built for something like retention or some other fundamental rule, and it really can't implement it well, you have to go back to the question of what is this thing actually capable of doing? How granular can I apply retention in this thing? And that's often a problem, right? It can't do things in a very granular fashion, and it can't handle event-based retention, things like that. You have to figure out where that borderline is. What can it do and what can it not do? And then, and we do this all the time for these kinds of systems. Then you have to start going to suboptimal retention rules and suboptimal retention rules and suboptimal retention rules until you find something that the software can actually do.
Dan, I want to direct this next question to you. How are these types of automated tools viewed by the courts? And because we have people outside of the U.S. also on here, so like the U.S. courts and maybe Canadian or those in other countries as well.
Sure. Pretty much most of the stuff operates under English common law, which basically boils down to if it's good enough for you in the regular course of business, it's good enough for the courts. And the courts have been very lenient about accepting the use of automated tools because they accept that this is a difficult problem, and so people can only spend so much and apply so much human content. That being said, you do need to have a certain standard in which you're addressing, and that's where the outsourcing can help. If you use an outsourcer, I have yet to see a case, I'm trying to think, I can't think of a single case where there's been an issue where the court said, no, there was a problem. There may be issues with the data collection that was before they gave it to the outsourcer, but they generally accept that if an outsourcer is working with the information, they're going to have processes that are used by a wide variety of organizations, and so that's sort of the reasonable state of the art. Now, there are a couple countries where it's a little bit different. If you get, Singapore or even certain things in France or other places, there's a whole different set of rules, and I'm not going to get into all of that today. But generally speaking, is the courts have been very accepting. As long as you're doing it for your own purposes to reduce costs and improve compliance and not just to hide information, then they're pretty lenient. I've seen some really bad implementations, and the courts have still said, okay, that's still okay.
I would agree with Dan. it's you know, the country's going to vary a little bit. The situation's going to have some influence on it. But courts have gotten pretty sophisticated. You know, it used to be, I'm an old timer here, and back in the old days, judges used to be very suspicious about the use of automated technologies for this stuff. And many years ago, you used to see judges that demanded these kind of insane manual inspections of really gigantic amounts of records and that kind of thing. You don't see that anymore. Judges have gotten smarter. They've gotten more sophisticated. There's actually a lot of, judges have conferences, things like that, professional conferences, where they teach about this kind of stuff. And judges have come to recognize a couple things. One, that these processes are at least as accurate as human, processes. And number two, the data volumes are such that a human process is flat impossible. Nobody's going to look at 50 terabytes of data manually. It's just never going to happen, right? And so if you want to proceed with the case, you have to use these kinds of processes. And if you want to get the documents into evidence, you have to accept the fact that these really large-scale automated systems were used. And so at the end of the day, in most places, in most circumstances, you're not going to have a problem. As Dan points out, you never can tell. There are some countries out there where they still want you to produce it on parchment, but that's getting increasingly rare. Most countries, particularly the larger countries these days, have electronic records laws of some kind that get past that problem.
John, I want to start this next question with you. What's a typical ROI, return on investment, or that payback period for these types of automated systems?
Well, there's going to be a little bit of variance there, depending on a number of circumstances, but it can be as short as 3 or 4 years, and it may be longer. And it also depends on how you calculate ROI, right? Because if you've got some sort of system that's managing your records, there's direct cost savings of some kind, in terms of reducing storage costs, limiting the number of servers on your system, and that's a big savings right there, because a server burns $100 worth of electricity a year. So just pulling server plugs out of the wall saves money. But then you get into harder to quantify things like more effective regulatory compliance, which can be a big deal if you're in the pharma industry or the aircraft industry or something like that, and reduced discovery costs. We've done some data collection with our clients, and I'll give you an example of that. In one particular instance, there was a detailed analysis of discovery costs and lawsuits, and in a bad situation, the discovery cost was $15 a document, which is a lot, given the millions of documents that can be produced in a commercial lawsuit. And at the low end, it was $7 a document, right? So that's $8 a document in savings through a well-managed discovery process that involves in large part well-managed electronic systems. Well, multiply that by the average 2 million documents in a commercial lawsuit, and that turns into a lot of money very, very quickly. And so when you get into that discovery savings and more effective regulatory compliance, the ROI can come very, very quickly because the penalties are so large for noncompliance.
Yeah, I've been doing ROIs on this stuff for 20 years now, and it's pretty straightforward for e-discovery, storage, regulatory pieces. The payback period typically is just over 2.5 years is what tracks. Now, everybody's environment can vary a little bit. If you add user productivity for where you're implementing new tools to improve collaboration and things like that, you do get additional cost savings, but that tends to be more variable, and so typically we'll classify that as soft savings, because just because you get a productivity gain doesn't mean that you can take it out of your budget. If I increase somebody's productivity by 10%, I'm not necessarily getting rid of that person, so it's really a false saving. So we typically track that, but it's pretty consistent. So between just a little over 2.5 years is the common payback on average.
Okay. Something else I just want to mention, if I can interrupt the question time for just a moment here, I just wanted to let everybody know that AIIM offers a variety of different training programs, and there is a link in the resources or at AIIM.org/training. But just AIIM does offer live instructor-led training as well as online self-paced classes on a variety of different topics. We can also arrange for a trainer to come to your place of business and provide custom perspectives of our instructor-led programs. A lot of different ways that we can help you learn everything that you need to learn about information management. There's also AIIM Certified Information Professional, and this certification is dedicated to enhancing and promoting the profession of information management. And we have a class called The Foundations of Intelligent Information Management, and not only is it a really very helpful, comprehensive overview to all the things about intelligent information management, but it's also an excellent review to prepare for the CIP exam. So information on all of this stuff can be found, as I mentioned, at AIIM.org/training. And we are getting to the end of our webinar time, and just a few last reminders. We have recorded this webcast, and so you'll be able to come back and listen to it again, invite others to listen to it, and we'll email everyone the URL to this shortly so you can come back right away and listen to this. Do download the resources. Do take our feedback survey. Very much want to thank our underwriter, Access. Without the support from our solution providers, AIIM wouldn't be able to bring you these free educational programs like our webinars here. So thank you, Access, for your sponsorship and your support. And as we bring our webinar to a close, I just want to leave you with our speakers' closing thoughts or key takeaways from everything that we've been discussing today. So first, I'm going to ask Dan AIIM for your closing thoughts today.
Sure. One of the things that I think is really helpful today is to work with your peer groups. Do some benchmarking to understand how you relate to your peers. And the good news is AIIM has a variety of things, including, of course, the show and conference, but also online resources where you can interact with your peers and develop small groups that you can see what others are doing. Not only will you get to learn from them, but you'll also get to see sort of what the state of the art is within your industry, so you can see where you need to be. One of the most powerful things that you can do from a justification perspective is to go to senior management and say, we lag our peers because we don't do these things or because we don't have these technologies or outsourcing things in place. Nobody wants to be left behind, and particularly in this era where if you are below the center of the bell curve, you can incur a higher liability. So that would be my final thought there.
Thanks, Dan. And John Montaigne, your closing thoughts today.
I would follow on from that and say this. Learn from other people's mistakes. One of the things you'll do when you'll discover when you talk to your peers is that their experience will vary widely. And the more of them you talk to, the more you'll discover that it varies widely. And if you talk to them in some detail about the solutions that they've attempted to implement, you'll discover what went well and what didn't go well. And if they are thoughtful, solid pros, they'll know why they didn't go well, right? And why they did go well. And that's going to be enormously helpful for you, because when you go out here and you have to craft a solution, knowing what's worked for other people, knowing their failure points, knowing the difficulties that they've encountered will help you craft a much better solution when your turn comes, and hopefully you will not therefore be amongst the people who have failed installation or solution.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you, Access, for your sponsorship with our webinar today, and you can reach out to them at accesscorp.com. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you, speakers, for your thoughtful insight, and we will see you with our next webcast. Have a good afternoon.